The single Korean word should have been a sound Kang Yong-hwan ignored. Just another murmur in a room full of sycophants. Another invisible breath from an invisible server who had cleared his table at the Obsidian Lounge for over a year. But when Lina Mensa leaned in, her voice a low vibration against the cold air of his authority, the word she whispered made the patriarch of the Kong Syndicate freeze mid-breath. It was a word spoken only by the dead, a secret buried in the soil of his homeland. Something sharp and dangerous sparked in his eyes. The look he gave just before a betrayal was purged. "Where did you hear that?" His voice was like grinding stone, the same tone that sent men to their knees in terror. Lina didn't flinch. She didn't retreat like the other staff currently holding their breath in the shadows. She simply stood her ground, her posture a storm disguised as courtesy. Beside them, his son Seojun surged forward, a guard dog realizing the gate was already open. "Get away from him," he hissed, his hand reaching for the holster beneath his sleek blazer. But Yong-hwan raised a single, trembling hand to stop his son. For the first time in 30 years of iron-fisted rule, the man who owned the city's shadows felt the ground shift beneath him. "Speak," he commanded, and the hierarchy of the room shattered forever. Lina had served the Kong family at their private table for 14 months without ever truly existing to them. To men like Yong-hwan, she was a ghost in a black vest, a pair of hands that replaced whiskey glasses and cleared crystal ashtrays without disturbing the conversation. She knew the rhythm of their power, the expensive scent of sandalwood, the weight of the silences, and the danger that pulsed through the lounge like a heartbeat. She knew the rules. They paid 5 times the standard service fee for one thing: absolute invisibility. Invisibility was Lina's survival. 24 years of navigating a world that preferred her silent had taught her how to move through high-stakes rooms without leaving a footprint. She kept her eyes down, her breathing rhythmic, her presence a perfected vacuum. Today, that careful silence had to die. She had overheard the whispers in the kitchen, seen the way the loyal lieutenants exchanged looks when Seojun turned his back. She knew the rent on her mother's apartment was overdue, and that the lounge manager would fire her for even speaking out of turn. But she also knew that if she didn't break the code of the silent witness right now, the man sitting in front of her wouldn't live to see the sunrise. The room was holding its breath, and Lina Mensa decided it was finally time to breathe. Lina Mensa moved through the Obsidian Lounge like a draft of cool air, felt but never truly looked at. She held the silver tray with a practiced, effortless balance, her fingers never trembling even as she skirted the edge of tables where deals involving millions, and sometimes lives, were whispered over 20-year-old scotch. In her 13 months at the lounge, she had mastered the geometry of the room. She knew exactly which floorboards in the VIP alcove were silent, and which shadows offered the best vantage point for anticipating a guest's needs before they even realized they had them. To the men who sat in the velvet booths, Lina was a ghost in a black vest. She was a non-entity, a piece of high-end furniture designed to facilitate their comfort and then vanish. But while they practiced the art of ignoring her, Lina practiced the art of observation. She had become a scholar of the men of shadows. She could tell the difference between the nervous tap of a man about to be betrayed and the arrogant lean of one who held all the cards. She watched the way Kang Yong-hwan's grip tightened imperceptibly on his glass when his son Seojun spoke too loudly. She noticed the sweat on the brow of the accountant who had been invited to dinner, but hadn't touched a single bite of his wagyu. Being invisible was a survival tactic she had perfected long before she stepped into the lounge. Growing up in a neighborhood where attention usually meant trouble, Lina had learned that the safest place to be was in plain sight but out of mind. It was a lonely skill, but a lucrative one. The Kong Syndicate paid for silence, and Lina gave it to them in abundance. She used the hours of her shift to read the room like a complex script, memorizing the hierarchies and the shifting alliances, all while maintaining the blank, professional mask of a perfect server. Tonight, the air in the lounge felt heavy, charged with a static that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. As she approached the patriarch's table to refresh the water, she didn't just see the men, she saw the trap. She saw the way the youngest lieutenant's eyes darted toward the exit, and how Seo-jun was too focused on his own reflection in his phone to notice the predator in the corner of the room. Lena felt the weight of her invisibility shifting. For the first time, being a ghost felt like a burden. She had spent a year learning their secrets, and now one of those secrets was about to get them killed. As she adjusted her vest and stepped into the light of the inner circle, she knew the ghost was about to haunt the living. The silence following the whisper was not empty. It was heavy, like the air before a lightning strike. While Kang Yonghwan remained frozen, his mind clearly racing through decades of buried history. His son did not share his father's contemplative stillness. Sun surged to his feet, the chair legs screeching against the marble floor, a jagged sound that made the other servers flinch in the distance. He moved with a predatory grace, stepping between Lena and the patriarch. His physical presence designed to intimidate, to re-establish the wall she had just climbed over. Outside. Now, Seo-jun commanded, his voice a low, dangerous rasp. He didn't wait for her to comply, his hand gripping her upper arm, not enough to bruise, but enough to signal that her status as an invisible guest was officially revoked. He led her into the dim, wood-paneled hallway behind the VIP lounge, a place where the music was a dull throb and the smell of expensive tobacco clung to the walls. He spun her around. His eyes narrowed into slits of dark fire. "Who are you working for?" he hissed, leaning into her space, trying to use his height to dwarf her. "That word doesn't exist in this city. Doesn't exist in the files. So, does the rival syndicate pay that well? Or are you just remarkably suicidal?" Lena didn't look at the floor. She didn't offer the submissive stutter he expected from a waitress caught in a web of monsters. Instead, she smoothed the front of her black vest, her movements calm and deliberate. "I work for the lounge, Mr. Kong," she replied, her voice steady. "And I work for my mother's rent. I don't have the luxury of being a spy. Don't lie to me." Seo-jun's jaw tightened, his hand slamming against the wall beside her head. The guard dog was snarling now, his groomed perfection cracking to reveal the enforcer beneath. "You've been a ghost for over a year. You don't speak, you don't look up, and then suddenly you're whispering family secrets into my father's ear? People like you don't just know things, Lena. They are taught things. Tell me who taught you, before I decide you're more useful as a warning than a witness." Lena saw the flicker of genuine fear in his eyes. Not fear of her, but fear for his father. He was a son trying to protect an empire, and in his world, anything unexpected was a threat. She realized then that Seo-jun didn't see her intelligence. He only saw a breach in his security. "I have spent 14 months being a shadow," she said softly, stepping toward him instead of away, catching him off guard. "While you were looking at spreadsheets and bodyguards, I was looking at the people you trust. I wasn't taught that word, Seo-jun. Heard it. And if you're as smart as your father, you'll stop worrying about my motives and start worrying about the man who said it." The hallway door creaked open, and the heavy silence of the corridor was broken by the rhythmic, heavy thud of a cane. Seo-jun straightened immediately, his aggression vanishing into a mask of rigid discipline as Kang Yonghwan emerged from the shadows of the VIP lounge. The patriarch didn't look at his son. His gaze was fixed entirely on Lena, his eyes searching her face with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "Leave us, Seo-jun," Yonghwan murmured. "Father, she's a security risk. We don't know who." "I know exactly who she is," the older man interrupted, his voice hushed but unbreakable. "She is the woman who has served my tea at exactly 65 degrees for 14 months without me ever asking. Now go." Once the door clicked shut, the hallway felt smaller, charged with a different kind of electricity. Yonghwan stepped closer, the scent of sandalwood and old parchment clinging to him. He didn't tower over her like his son had. Instead, he watched her with a weary curiosity. "That word," he began, his voice trembling slightly. "It isn't used in the markets or the boardrooms. It's a dialect from a village that was wiped off the map 40 years ago. My mother used it to describe the light on the water just before a storm. How does a girl from this city carry a dead man's language in her mouth?" Lena didn't blink. I don't carry the language, Mr. Kong. I carry the truth of the people who speak it. You think I've been watching your enemies, but I've been watching you. I've seen the way you look at the portrait in your study when you think the house is empty. I've seen the way you hesitate before signing certain orders. She took a breath, her heartbeat steady despite the proximity of a man who could end her with a nod. You're not a monster to me. You're a man who is grieving a world no one else remembers. And the man who used that word tonight. He wasn't using it as a greeting. He was using it as a signal. He knows your history, and he's using it to find your heart. Yonghwan's hand tightened on the head of his cane until his knuckles turned white. He had spent decades building a fortress of fear, ensuring no one got close enough to see the cracks in his armor. Yet here was this woman, a waitress he had treated as part of the scenery, deconstructing his soul with terrifying precision. He realized then that Lena hadn't just overheard a secret, she had understood the emotional weight behind it. She didn't know his crimes, but she knew his ghost. You are a dangerous woman, Lena Mensa, he whispered, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Not because of what you know, but because you aren't afraid of the man everyone else trembles before. Fear is a wall, Mr. Kong, she replied softly. I prefer to look through the windows. The shift in the lounge was immediate and suffocating. Within 24 hours, the unspoken rules of the Obsidian Lounge had been rewritten. By the order of the patriarch himself, Lena was no longer to rotate through the floor or attend to the minor captains. She was assigned exclusively to Table 1, the heavy obsidian slab in the furthest corner where the air always seemed 5 degrees colder. Lena felt the weight of 100 stairs as she crossed the floor. The background staff, her fellow servers who used to share quick, commiserating glances in the pantry, now looked through her as if she were a different kind of ghost. Their silence was no longer professional. It was curdled with fear. To them, her sudden elevation wasn't a promotion. It was a death sentence or a betrayal. Rumors rippled through the kitchen like oil on water. Whispers that she was a honey trap, a spy, or worse, the woman who had finally found the old man's weakness. At the table, the tension was a physical pressure. Sujin sat to his father's right, his jaw so tight it looked carved from granite. Every time Lena leaned in to pour the tea or set down a small plate of banchan, Seojun's eyes followed her every movement, tracking her hands as if they held a blade instead of a porcelain cup. He was a man watching a breach in his fortress grow wider, unable to stop the person who had been invited inside. Yonghwan, however, was transformed. He ignored the restless energy of his lieutenants and the dark scowl of his son. He sat with his back to the wall, his gaze following Lena with an unsettling, quiet focus. When she placed his drink before him, his fingers brushed the tablecloth near hers, a gesture that, in the rigid hierarchy of the Kong Syndicate, was as intimate as a confession. They are talking about you, Lena, Yonghwan said, his voice cutting through the low murmur of the room. He didn't look up, but the entire table went silent. My men think I have grown soft. They think I have brought a civilian into the sanctum because I am lonely. Lena didn't pause. She adjusted the placement of his glass by a fraction of an inch, her movements as calm as the eye of a hurricane. Let them think what they want, Mr. Kong. Men who spend their lives looking for monsters usually miss the person standing right in front of them. A low hiss of indrawn breath came from one of the captains at the end of the table. To speak so boldly was a violation of every protocol they lived by. Sojun looked ready to erupt, but Yonghwan simply let out a short, dry laugh, a sound so rare it made the guard dogs shift in their seats. The private table had become a stage, and as Lena stepped back into the shadows, she knew she was no longer just a witness. She was the center of a storm that was beginning to tear the syndicate apart. The air in the private suite was thick with the copper tang of blood and the sterile scent of fear. A man, a high-ranking associate from a partner syndicate, was currently pinned against the mahogany sideboard, his collar twisted in the iron grip of one of Yonghwan's enforcers. Glassware rattled as the man stammered, his denials coming in frantic, wet gasps. Sujin stood over him, his face a mask of cold, modern efficiency, ready to signal the violence that would end the negotiation permanently. Lena entered the room with a fresh pot of barley tea. She didn't pause at the sight of the struggle or the dark smear on the man's lip. She moved with her signature storm disguised as courtesy. Her eyes focused solely on the porcelain she carried. The enforcers ignored her, as they always did, treating her presence as a backdrop to their brutality. "He's lying, father," Seojun barked, looking toward Yonghwan, who sat in the shadows, his face unreadable. "He knows where the shipment was diverted. Let me take him downstairs." The man on the sideboard sobbed, a sound of pure, panicked desperation. "I don't know. I swear on my children." Lena stepped forward to refill Yonghwan's cup. As the steam rose between them, she didn't look at the patriarch. Instead, she let her gaze drift toward the man being held. She noticed the way his eyes weren't darting toward the door, but toward the gold watch on his wrist, a watch that was 3 sizes too large, sliding down his thin arm. She noticed the way he clutched a small, crumpled photograph in his free hand, his thumb rubbing the corner raw. "He isn't lying about the shipment," Lena said softly, her voice cutting through the heavy tension like a silk ribbon. The room went deathly silent. Seojun spun around, his face reddening. "Stay in your place, waitress." But Yonghwan raised a hand, his eyes narrowing. "Explain." Lena set the teapot down with a deliberate click. "A man who is stealing millions doesn't wear his father's oversized watch because he can't afford his own. And a man who is betraying you doesn't hold a picture of his family like a prayer rope. He hides them. He isn't hiding a shipment, Mr. Kong. He's hiding a debt." She turned her calm, intelligent gaze to the terrified man. "The people who actually took your shipment have his daughter, don't they? That's why you're here. You're not a thief. You're a decoy." The man collapsed, his legs giving out as the enforcer released him in shock. He began to wail, confirming every word Lena had intuited. She had seen the emotional subtext that the men of violence had missed. She hadn't used a weapon, she had used the truth. Yonghwan looked from the broken man to Lena, a new kind of respect, and perhaps something more dangerous, flickering in his dark eyes. He realized then that while his son was a master of force, this woman was a master of the human soul. The storm had arrived, and it didn't look like a war. It looked like a girl with a teapot. The sanctuary of the lounge felt like a distant memory as Lena walked toward her mother's apartment, the cold night air of the city pressing against her skin. She had spent months perfecting her invisibility, but tonight she felt like a beacon in the dark. The respect she had earned from Yonghwan was a heavy crown, and its weight was starting to crush the life she had worked so hard to protect. She reached the familiar peeling door of the apartment, but she didn't hear the comforting sound of the evening news or the rhythmic stir of her mother's cooking. The silence was wrong, jagged and unnatural. When she pushed the door open, her heart collided with her ribs. The small living room had been tossed with a surgical, terrifying precision. Her mother sat on the worn velvet sofa, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of gray terror. Standing by the window was a man Lena recognized, one of the lieutenants who had been passed over when Yonghwan had assigned her to the private table. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't need to. His presence in her home, the violation of her only safe space, was a message louder than any gunshot. "You're a clever girl, Lena," the man said, his voice smooth and devoid of the deference he showed in the lounge. He picked up a framed photograph of Lena's graduation, turning it over in his gloved hands. "You see things others miss. So surely you see how this ends. You've confused the chairman's curiosity for protection. But the syndicate, we are a body, and we do not like foreign objects near the heart." Lena stepped forward, her voice a low, steady vibration. "This has nothing to do with my mother. If you have a problem with the chairman's orders, take it up at the table." The man laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "The chairman is an old man dreaming of dead villages. We are the ones who keep this city running. You've made us look like fools, reading us like we're children's books. If you're still in that lounge tomorrow, If you so much as whisper another word into his ear, this apartment won't just be messy. It will be empty. He dropped the photograph. The glass shattered against the hardwood, the sound echoing like a finality. As he walked past her, his shoulder brushed hers, a deliberate bruising contact. Lena sank onto the sofa beside her mother, who was trembling so violently the cushions shook. For the first time, the ghost in the vest felt the terrifying reality of being seen. She had used her emotional intelligence to save a man's life, but in doing so, she had painted a target on the people she loved. The price of her knowledge was no longer just her job. It was the blood she had spent her life trying to keep out of the shadows. As she held her mother, Lena realized that the storm disguised as courtesy was no longer enough. To survive the syndicate, she would have to become the very thing she had spent her life observing. The tension within the penthouse had reached a fever pitch, a suffocating heat that had nothing to do with the climate control. Yonghwan sat at the head of the long lacquer table, the shattered remains of Lena's graduation photo, which he had recovered from her apartment, lying between him and his son. Seojun paced the length of the room, his movements jagged, his shadow flickering against the walls like a flame. "This is the better way she speaks of?" Seojun demanded, gesturing toward the broken glass. "Your lieutenants are revolting, father. They see you listening to a waitress, a civilian who plays with emotions while our enemies consolidate power. Traditional methods exist for a reason. Blood maintains the hierarchy. We find the man who threatened her mother, and we make an example of him. That is how we survive." Yonghwan looked at the photo, then at Lena, who stood by the window. She was no longer wearing the server's vest. She wore her own clothes, her spine straight, her gaze fixed on the city lights. She looked like a woman who had already accepted her fate. "And if you kill them, Seojun," Lena said, her voice a calm anchor in the room's turbulence, "you only prove they were right to fear you. But you don't cure the rot. They threaten my family because they are terrified that the chairman is starting to see the world through a lens they can't control. You can choose blood, and you will spend the rest of your life watching your back, even in your own home. Or you can choose to lead through the truth I showed you, that loyalty built on understanding is stronger than loyalty built on the grave." Seojun stopped pacing, his face contorted. "She is a poison, father. She's making you weak." Yonghwan finally stood, the heavy thud of his cane echoing like a gavel. He looked at his son, the heir he had groomed in the image of his own ruthlessness. Then he looked at Lena, the woman who had whispered a dead language and brought his soul back to life. "Strength is not the ability to take a life, Seojun," Yonghwan said softly. "It is the courage to change a world that demands you be a monster." He turned to his son, his eyes hard but weary. "You want to use traditional methods. Fine. The tradition of this family is to protect what is ours. And Lena Mensa is now under my personal protection. Not as a server and not as a shadow. If a single hair on her head or her mother's is touched, it is not a lieutenant you will answer to, it is me. But we will not purge the ranks with blood today. We will purge them with the truth she found. We will address the debts, not the throats." Seojun stared at his father, the realization dawning on him that the guard dog no longer recognized the master. The choice had been made. Yonghwan had chosen the whisper over the roar, and in doing so, he had effectively declared war on the only world he had ever known. The penthouse was no longer a sanctuary. It was a siege map. Outside the reinforced floor-to-ceiling windows, the city lights flickered, indifferent to the fact that the Kong Empire was tearing itself apart. The elevator had been cut, the phone lines were dead, and the distant sound of muffled shouting echoed from the lobby. The body of the syndicate was finally purging its head. Yonghwan sat in his high-backed leather chair, not with the posture of a king, but with the stillness of a man who had already seen the end. He hadn't touched his tea. Seojun was gone, having stormed out an hour ago to lead a final desperate defense of the perimeter, or perhaps to negotiate his own survival. The lieutenants had made their move, and the air was thick with the scent of ozone and impending rain. Lena stood by the heavy oak desk, her hands resting on the surface. She hadn't left. Even when he had offered her a way out through the service entrance before the lockdown, she had stayed. "You should have gone," Yonghwan said, his voice barely a whisper against the low hum of the emergency generators. "They don't want you. They want the chair. If you stay, you become part of the wreckage." "I told you once, I don't look for the monsters, Mr. Kong," Lena replied, her voice the only steady thing in the room. "I look for the people. And right now, the only person I see is you." Yonghwan let out a dry, rattling breath that might have been a laugh. He looked up at her, and for the first time, the mask of the patriarch was completely gone. In its place was a profound, aching vulnerability. "In 40 years, I have built a world of echoes. I surrounded myself with men who told me what I wanted to hear because they feared me, and a son who told me what I wanted to hear because he wanted to be me. Every smile, every bow, every loyalty was a transaction, a lie wrapped in silk." He reached out, his hand hovering over the desk before Lena placed hers beneath it, offering a grounding warmth. "Then you arrived. A girl who was supposed to be a shadow. You spoke a word that broke my heart, and then you told me truths that threatened my life. You're the only one, Lena. In all these years, in all this blood and gold, you are the only person who hasn't lied to me." The sound of the heavy doors being breached downstairs vibrated through the floorboards. The coup was at the doorstep. Yonghwan gripped her hand, his eyes burning with a sudden, fierce clarity. "They think they are taking my power," he whispered. "But they don't realize that for the first time in my life, I actually have something real to lose." Lena didn't pull away. She leaned in, her presence a storm of quiet courage, as the world they had both known began to burn. The chaos of that final night did not end in a funeral, but in a birth. 5 years later, the morning sun poured into a bright, airy office that overlooked the Seoul skyline, a space designed not for hiding, but for transparency. On the glass door, the name of the venture was etched in simple, elegant script. Mensakong Strategic Consulting. Lena stood by the window, no longer wearing a server's vest or the weight of a ghost. She wore a tailored suit of deep emerald, her presence commanding the room with the same quiet courage that had once frozen a room full of killers. Beside her, Yonghwan watched the city, his cane resting against a desk covered in legitimate contracts and architectural blueprints. He looked younger than he had in the lounge, the deep lines of grief and paranoia having softened into the dignified weariness of a man who finally slept at night. The syndicate had not vanished, but it had evolved. Under the pressure of that night's truth, the body had been forced to adapt or die. Those who couldn't survive without blood had been purged by the law, while those who remained had transitioned into the light, guided by the better way Lena had envisioned. Seo-jun was now the CEO of their shipping logistics arm, still a guard dog, but one who protected legal borders and ethical supply chains. He had learned that a name built on respect lasted longer than one built on fear. "The board meeting for the community housing project starts in 10 minutes, Lena said, turning to Yonghwan. She reached out, adjusting the lapel of his coat with a familiarity that spoke of years of shared battles and quiet mornings. Yonghwan placed his hand over hers, his fingers lingering on the wedding band that caught the light. "I was thinking about the lounge today," he murmured. "About the man who sat in the dark and the woman who dared to step into it." "He was a lonely man," Lena replied softly. "And she was tired of being invisible. You saved more than just my life that night, Lena. You saved my legacy." He looked at her with an expression of profound, unclouded love, the look of a man who was no longer an echo, but a person. "In a world that tried to make us shadows, we chose to be seen." Lena smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder for a brief, grounded moment. They had built a new dynasty, one not founded on secret languages or dead villages, but on the radical honesty of two souls who had refused to remain ghosts. As they walked toward the boardroom together, the sound of their footsteps was no longer a signal of danger, but a heartbeat of a new world. In the city that once treated them as non-entities, Lena Mensa and Kong Yonghwan had finally found their way home.